Thank you very much for joining us. I'm excited about a new series that I want to start today. The series I'm calling simply The Tribes. I have thought about this for quite some time. I've worked on various things to prepare us to this, to get us to this place so that I could teach this. So this isn't something that I just sprung on us. It's something that I've actually been thinking about for quite some time. It just so happens that today corresponds, at least in name, to the tribes based on the annual cycle of Torah reading. So the annual cycle of Torah reading brings us to the point where today's Torah portion is called Matot. Now they've combined, according to the calendar, they've combined Matot and Maseh, the last two Torah portions of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. But Matot means tribes. And so I think that it is quite interesting that there is a correspondence or a correlation between the weekly Torah portion and what I'm going to be talking about today. This was not really by design, or at least not that part, or at least not by me. I didn't design it that way. So perhaps maybe there is some sort of design working behind the scenes. I can't really take credit for that. But it really, over the last several weeks, I've been thinking about moving into this particular class. I spent quite a bit of time over the last several months bringing us to a point, I think, in our understanding of Scripture. I've said this many times. Most of the people who log in and join us for Shabbat studies are quite able students and self-trained scholars, if you will, of the Bible anyway. So you have studied quite a bit of Scripture. You've studied extensively over the years, and you're very well informed. But I did want to bring, before I got into this major study on the tribes, and I see this going over many, many weeks, I wanted to get some things out of the way first. I wanted to establish that regardless of one's genealogy, if you will, regardless of where one could trace one's line to, God's plan is open to you. In other words, there are things people might say, well, you really can't prove anything in regards to the tribes. Well, proof is a very difficult word. I mean, there are people who could challenge quite a bit of things. There are people who say you can't prove the validity of virtually anything from the Bible. You know, there are people who say that. But I wanted to establish, first of all, that regardless of if someone says, well, I'm of the nations. You know, I've often said I could be, if I traced my genealogy back, I could be a Hittite, a Perizzite, a Hivite. It doesn't really matter. There are plenty of passages which I think lend to this particular idea that ultimately God's plan is open to everyone. But I wanted to bring up a couple of things that are quite important, and we're going to get into some of those today. Now, I did want to say that one of the main reasons that I have decided to move into this study after taking several years off from teaching on this particular subject, I think, and that is in the Constitution and bylaws of United Israel World Union. This is my copy. This goes back to the 40s, the 1940s. You see it's in fairly bad repair, but I'm very careful with it. The objects and purposes. So I want to kind of start off with that to set a precedent and to suggest that this very directly ties with the organizational objectives and purposes of United Israel World Union. So this is what David wrote in 1943. I think this is published in 44. The objects and purposes of United Israel World Union, Inc. are, notice it starts, to reawaken the lost tribes of Israel to consciousness of their true identity, to bring this about by means of conveying to them true knowledge of the Bible and of history, particularly by publications dealing with the identity of Israel, to unite the lost tribes with Judah by means of inculcating original biblical truths through publications and lectures, to facilitate the return of all Israel to the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and to his republic as founded by Moses. And above all, to work and strive for that glorious peace, the plans for which are fully laid down in the writings containing the blueprint of God's ordained world order, the Bible, to establish places of devotion and spiritual guidance for its members, and so forth. So to begin with, it is something which our organization is based at least in part on, and that's the realization that scattered among the nations are the descendants of what is defined in this document as the lost tribes of Israel. People have heard the phrase, the lost tribes of Israel. There are myths, there are mysteries, there are books, there are movies, there are Nova specials. Lots of people are interested in this subject. We want to talk about it from a very grounded, a very biblical basis. And I want to begin this series letting you know that we're going to leave no stone unturned. So, United Israel World Union believes that the Bible speaks of all Israel, and that all Israel encompasses more than, let's just say, meets the eye. When we talk about all Israel, we're talking about a people chosen by Jehovah. A people chosen by Jehovah. Look, I just want to hit a couple of verses. Go with me to the book of Exodus, Exodus 19 and verse 5, Exodus 19:5. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye, plural, shall be my own possession, my segulah, from among all the people, for all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this particular people, all Israel, are called a segulah. You've had this class before. There are quite a few texts which talk about Israel as God's own special treasure among all the people. He owns all the earth. All the people are mine, he says. But Israel is a segulah, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Israel is referred to as the elect, the servant nation. Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah as it's often called. Once you get to Isaiah chapter 40 through Isaiah 66 especially, there is a recurring theme, a group known as the Eved Adonai, the Eved Jehovah, the servant of Jehovah. And that servant is clearly defined, at least in part, as the nation of Israel. Israel, the people, this chosen people, are even referred to in some texts as the Messiahs, the anointed. You'll recall in Psalm 105, it talks about that when they were few in number, wandering from nation to nation, that God allowed no one to tamper with his people, unless, of course, he allowed it for punitive purposes. But it states very clearly, touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. It's talking about a people, not about a messianic figure, if you will. People make more to do about the messianic figures than the texts themselves do, but that's another class. The people about whom I'm speaking are called a covenant people, a light unto the nations. So what we get when we open Scripture, as my teacher often puts it, from Genesis chapter 12 on, we're basically dealing with the story of one man's family. I mean, beginning in Genesis 1 all the way through chapter 11, it's more of a universal approach. It deals with the nations of the world and how we all have a common starting point, which I've stressed leading up to this teaching, that ultimately the plan is open to all. In fact, working through this one people, this one man's family, the goal ultimately, as we'll point out over the next several weeks, is that ultimately the plan is that blessing will come as a result of this chosen people. The blessing will reach all the ends of the earth because of the faithfulness of one man's family. We're talking about the seed of Abraham, my friend, when we talk about this particular family. This family has a task to do, a work of monumental proportions, if you will, a God-ordained task. It's not just a title or a place of chosenness that has no responsibility with it. To whom much is given, much is required. And this particular family, which is chosen, has the most important task that's ever been delegated to anyone or any group. And we're going to be talking about that as well. You see, it is by this family and through this particular family, the seed of Abraham, that Jehovah has worked, is working, and will work to bring about his ultimate plans and purposes for the entire world. According to Jehovah, through the prophet Amos, in Amos chapter 3, in verse 2, it says, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth," addressing this man's family. "You only have I known of all the families of the earth." In Hebrew, "Rachetkim yadati michol mishpachot ha'adamah." Just you. The importance of this particular family and their assigned role cannot be underemphasized or understressed. Everything, literally everything of consequence that is laid out in Scripture relates in some way specifically to the chosen people and the plan that was entrusted to them and is still demanded of them by Jehovah. The history contained within this book that we call the Bible is their history. The instructions, the rules, the regulations is theirs to keep, at least initially. They are demanded not only to keep these things, to listen to them, to learn them, to guard them and do them, but to model them in such a way that the rest of the world is influenced to move in that direction. Deuteronomy talks about this, how that the nations will look at the way that they model this particular way, if you will, and they'll say, what a great and wise people is this. The covenants that are outlined in this particular book are given to and through the seed of Abraham. Now, others, as we've pointed out very clearly, are welcome to attach themselves to the covenant. One can't read the Bible and not understand this. If you open up to Isaiah chapter 56, Isaiah 56 is very, very clear on this. That the son of the stranger who attaches himself to the covenant and so forth, that they will be given, it says, a place and a name better than sons and daughters, right? So it's not exclusive in that sense. You're not allowed to join with, but the covenants are given to and through the people of Israel. Prophecy will find its ultimate fulfillment and realization in this family that Jehovah has chosen. Talking about the household of Abraham, the seed of Abraham, who is called in 3 places the friend of God. You'll recall in the Hebrew Bible, this particular phrase shows up in Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 7. Abraham is called the friend of God. Now the question, when I talk about and I teach on the subject of the tribes, I'm asking very plainly, who is Israel? Now this can cause a lot of differences of opinion. This can raise flags. Some people begin to think, oh, here we go. Someone else claiming to be Israel. That's brought about a lot of bad things over time. But this particular question, to whom does the name make reference? Biblically, when we see the name Israel, who are we talking about? I will tell you that this question and the related studies that we're going to get into, that we're going to unpack over the next several weeks and months, is something that opened my eyes to a whole new understanding of Scripture when I first saw this, now close to 30 years ago. This particular realization, this understanding, led to my work with my teacher and my now friend and colleague, Dr. James Tabor, and many others, I might add. And I'll share some of those personal stories as this study goes on, because I think it's important so that people kind of get the history of the development of some of these connections. But many of you also have had your eyes open to an understanding of who is Israel. First things first, I want to get this out. I want to make sure that no one is confused in the least bit. When I talk about Israel, I want to tell you that the Jewish people are literally and physically Israel. Right? So some of these groups who begin to teach on the lost tribes and the house of Israel and so forth, some of these groups begin to take away from the significance of the Jewish people. They begin to suggest that the Jewish people aren't really Israel, that there's some imposter group. There are all sorts of really bad things out there that do that. This is not what I'm doing at all. I'm saying that the Jewish people are clearly part of this group, this family of Abraham. They are in every sense, literally and physically, Israel. They are the seed of Abraham. They have not been replaced. There is no scriptural indication, no hint, no clue, no allusion of any change in their status. So I want to make sure that people understand that very clearly. The Jewish people today were, are, and will remain part of the people of Israel. There's no such thing. You might want to write this down. There is no such thing as spiritual Israel. It's not a concept. It's not a word found, a phrase found in Scripture. Israel is Israel. When Scripture speaks of Israel, it means the descendants of the patriarch Yaakov, Jacob, in a literal sense. But to fully grasp the biblical message, we must go to the Bible. We must examine the subject from cover to cover, leaving no stone unturned. And we're not going to get through all that today, I assure you. So what I've had to do is come up with some ideas, putting together somewhat of a lesson plan that I'm extending for many, many weeks as I work through this material. But I want to start by stressing that with all the legends and myth and lore and everything that you might find out there, the Bible has to be our guide. We have to speak where the Bible speaks. We should be silent where the Bible's silent. We should call Bible things by Bible names and do Bible things in Bible ways. This idea of going to the Scripture first. If we talk about myths, if we talk about legends, we need to make sure that people understand that that's what we're doing. And I will. So in other words, I will get into other things as we work through this material. We might make reference to the rabbinic literature in terms of what do the rabbis say about this particular group. But when we do that, we'll make sure that we point out where we're retrieving this particular information from. Now, I want to go this morning to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah chapter 44. And by the way, there are so many different places to begin this study. So I know some of you are thinking, oh, I hope he covers this verse or that verse. Chances are we'll get to a lot of those at the right time. So in other words, I know that in fact there's so many prophetic texts that deal with this subject that some of you are kind of thinking about, okay, let's go here first. Let's go first to Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah chapter 44, and I want to begin in verse 1. Isaiah chapter 44, verse 1. Yet now hear, O Jacob my servant, and Israel who I have chosen. Thus saith Jehovah that made you and formed you from the womb, who will help you. Fear not, O Jacob my servant, and you, Yeshurun, whom I have chosen. For I will pour water upon him that is thirsty, and streams upon the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon your seed, and my blessing upon your offspring, and they shall spring up among the grass, as willows by the watercourses. One shall say, I am Jehovah's. Another shall call himself by the name of Jacob, and another shall subscribe his hand unto Jehovah and surname himself by the name of Israel. Now, this particular text is quite interesting to me. It's addressed to Jacob, my servant, and Israel, my chosen ones. The question is, as we read this, the situation described is quite interesting. So it talks about that there will be an outpouring of the Spirit on the seed of Jacob and Israel. But notice the comparison and the text and the way it describes the situation when this outpouring takes place. It says it's like water on dry ground. Water on dry ground. And then this picture is one that describes a springing up of new life. It's almost that when this water touches the dry ground, something comes to life, and the text says that people begin to call themselves Israel. They call themselves by the name Jacob. What was formerly dry ground, when the water comes, or in this case, when the Spirit comes upon this particular earth, that the life that comes up, it's basically a coming back from a stage of dormancy. And these people call themselves Israel, and they name themselves by the name of Jacob. Now, I believe that we are living in such a time as this. I believe that to some degree that the water is falling upon this dry ground, and that around the world there is new life springing up, and people are saying, I'm Israel, I'm Jacob. They're attaching themselves to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're turning from other faiths, and they are seeking to follow the ways of Jehovah, many of them in a very strict and dedicated form. What's going on? What's going on that's causing this? Now, some might say it's just a coincidence. The people, Ross, that are waking up, that are turning to God, they're not Israel. They have nothing to do with all of those hundreds and hundreds of biblical texts which say that there will be a great awakening among the nations, a great turning to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's not them. People would argue, some laugh and mock this idea and say, look, these people are they were Christians and now they think they're Israel and so forth. And they think it's, they just think it's ridiculous. And they say, you can't prove it. You can't prove it. Well, what I'm trying to do is, and what I intend to do over the course of this series, is to look at the text of the Bible and say, what does the Bible say is going to happen, and how will we know who this group is? Because if this group, which is currently waking up and ascribing to themselves the name Jacob and calling themselves Israel, if they're not Israel truly, if they're just people who would love to believe that they are, but they're really descendants of the Amorites, Hittites, Hivites, and so forth, then when the real group comes to themselves, I'll tell you, it's going to look a lot like it looks right now. It's just perhaps a coincidence that these prophecies appear to be seeing signs of fulfillment, when actuality, according to some, this is not at all what's going on. So you see, I'm being a bit facetious. Some would say, look, I know that what's going on looks a little bit? People literally from around the world are saying things like this. I'm reading my Bible and the Lord spoke to me. They'll say something like this. Or they feel led to not eat unclean foods anymore. Or how many times have we heard stories about people who said, I just couldn't stop thinking about Shabbat. I had to begin keeping Shabbat. These are people from remote places all over. Like they weren't raised in this tradition. In fact, they were raised believing that everything in that Old Testament was done away with, and now all of a sudden they're saying, no, it is valid, and I'm responsible for this today. They even have Jewish people telling them, you don't have to keep that, that's not for you. But interestingly enough, this group of awakening souls doesn't care. They don't care what other people think about them. They feel inside. It's like something is happening on the inside. Deuteronomy 30, and we'll get into all of this over the course of the study. Deuteronomy 30 says, when all these things happen to you, the blessings and the curse, and you find yourself scattered among the nations and so forth, when you return to your heart, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it described like this. Just, Ross, something on the inside caused me to. Now, they've been beat down because so many people say, well, you don't really know that. You don't know who you, you don't have any genealogy that proves that, and so forth. I want you to go with me to the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea. And I want to go to chapter 12. Hosea chapter 12. Hosea 12. And I want to go to verse 4. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. And in his manhood, he strove with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept. He made supplication unto him. He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with us. The referent here, this text is speaking about Jacob. Hosea is talking in the 12th chapter about the patriarch Jacob. We're familiar with his story. It's partly recounted here. Some of the high points are mentioned here in Hosea's prophetic word. We know this Jacob quite well from the book of Genesis. In this particular text, something stands out. It says that he met him at Bethel. And it says, there he spake with us. Now, look at your translation there. Look at verse 4 in Hosea chapter 12. Some translations say that at Bethel he spoke to him. You see, that would almost seemingly make more sense because he met him at Bethel and he spoke to him there. But the Hebrew, in some translations, which accurately reflect the Hebrew, says that it was at Bethel that he spoke with us. Now, why would it say that? Is it a mistake in the text? Is it that Hosea chapter 12 in the Hebrew has a mistake and it should say he spoke with him, meaning God spoke with Jacob there? Or is that what it's supposed to say? Is it supposed to say, and there he spoke with us? Perhaps this is not a mistake at all. Perhaps it means exactly what it says. Perhaps Hosea is given some spiritual and prophetic insight that he is telling us something that many people read right over. So this brings up a very interesting thing. Again, to study the tribes is a very interesting it's a very interesting thing. You can begin in many places to cover this material. I chose to do it this way because I want to establish something very important from the outset, and then we can get into all sorts of other parts and pieces to this huge study, and we can begin to unpack it. The prophet says that the events that he is describing are in a way speaking to us. And I think that's the case. We're going to see also, by the way, throughout this series, how important the words of Hosea are in regards to communicating the prophetic scenario involving Israel. So we're going to get into that at another point. But Hosea means to focus us on or focus our attention on the patriarch Jacob, and that's indicated in context. In verse 2, it says Jacob. Verse 3, it gives us the clues as to who is being referred to here. in the womb he took his brother by the heel, right? Who does that? Yaakov. His name, Yaakov. Akov is a word, akav is the heel. So he healed, Heeled, his brother. He's known as a supplanter, a trickster. In the womb he did that. Hosea's point is that this one that I'm focusing your attention to has struggled the entire duration of his existence. From the womb, as a man, it says he strove with the Malach. He fought with an angel and prevailed. Very interesting. So I want us to go this morning to the book of Bereshit, to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32. And I want to give you a little bit of context because I want to make a point here about the significance of this story. Now, the reason that I'm doing this, if I didn't make this plain, is that Hosea chapter 12 says that at Bethel, God spoke with us. Now, as far as the text is concerned, the only person at Bethel with Jehovah is Jacob. So how is it that that's going to speak with us? I think you'll be interested to see this. Now, just to give you the context, in Genesis chapter 32, Jacob has been in exile. I want to use carefully selected words. In chapter 28, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, Jacob flees for his life. His brother Esau wants to kill him. So Jacob goes into exile. He had fled from his brother. He goes and serves his uncle for wives. Go into that. You know the stories. He serves many, many years for his wives. He grows tired of being mistreated. And at a certain stage, he's had enough. He talks to his women, and he says, we're leaving. And they do leave, and they leave without announcing their departure. Lavan, the father-in-law, is upset by this, and he chases them down. You remember the story. Ultimately, they make a covenant, Jacob and Lavan, and then I want you to look at Genesis 32 and Genesis 32 and verse 2. Genesis 32, 2. And Jacob went on his way, and the messengers of God met him. And Jacob said when he saw them, this is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Mahanaim. So Jacob sees the Malachim, the messengers. And when he sees them, the Malachi Elohim, the messengers of Elohim, he says, this is God's camp. And then he calls this place Mahanaim, which means two camps. Two camps. Now this is important. He names this place Mahanaim, which means two camps. Now he had been concerned when he's going back into the land from exile that his brother will still be angry and kill him. You remember the story. Now look down at verse 8, chapter 32 of Genesis, verse 8. If Esau, this is the reason he divides his group into two camps. Let's look at verse 7. Now in Hebrew, I believe it's verse 8. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and was distressed. And he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two companies. Now in Hebrew, that's lishnei machanot, two camps. So he's got his women, he's got his children, 11 of his children. Benjamin has not been born yet. And he divides everything into two camps. Now his thought is this: if my brother is still angry and he attacks the one camp, perhaps the other camp will survive, right? He's sort of a dividing in the case he's attacked. Now, I want you to listen to his prayer. I want you to listen closely to Jacob's prayer. Verse 9 in English, verse 10 in Hebrew. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Jehovah, who said unto me, return unto your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the loving kindness and all the truth which you have showed unto your servant, for with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I've become two camps, lishnei machanot. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and smite me, the mother with the children. And you said, I will surely do you good, and make your seed as numerous as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And he camps there. It's very interesting, because what I have begun to understand, whenever we read these stories, these historical, sacred histories, these historical narratives, I see connections with the prophetic fulfillment. Jacob says, when I left, I just had my staff. Now, as I come back into the land, I am two camps. Now, one of the things that I'm going to talk about in this study is, and many of you know this, about the two houses that make up Israel, the two families. Jeremiah talks about the two families, but there are two distinct groups. Remember, I told you that the Jewish people represent Israel. They represent part of this family. We're going to get into understanding the full story here as we work our way through. Now look in Genesis chapter 32, go down to verse 23. Verse 22 in English, I believe. And he rose up that night, he took his two wives, his two handmaids, his 11 children, and passed over the ford of Yavok. And he took them and sent them over the stream and sent over that which he had. Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was strained as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. And he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said unto him, what is your name? And he said, Yaakov, Jacob. And he said, your name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Now, a couple of points. Hosea chapter 12 tells us about this wrestling match, if you will. You see, I said that. I didn't say it like a southern gentleman. I didn't say wrestling match. It's a wrestling match. He tells us about this wrestling, the struggle with the Malach, and he tells him, he says that it happens at Bethel. So that God speaks with us. So we go looking at the text with this match, the struggle between the Malach and Jacob, and it doesn't tell us that it happened at Bethel. Now, I think God speaks to us through this text in a way. We begin to learn certain things. We begin to learn that when Israel comes back into the land, that they will be in two camps. I think that this is a prophetic picture. And I'm not much on types and shadows, but I think that we have an interesting point here to make, and we shouldn't bypass it. We shouldn't gloss over it. According to the context, the geography here tells us that they're at the ford of Yavok, and they're at a place called Peniel. Now, is that Bethel? Look at a Bible map. You make a call. Now, here we have a story relating the name change from Yaakov to Israel. Hosea, remember, says that it happens at Bethel. So now what I want to do is I want to go to a couple of texts which do happen at Bethel and see if we can discern what it is that God is speaking with us in those places. Go with me to the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verse 10. And it says, "And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. Behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the messengers, the angels of God, ascending and descending on it. And behold, Jehovah stood above it and said, Ani Yehovah, I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to your seed. And your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee whithersoever thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, and I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, Surely Jehovah is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid and said, How dreadful is this place? This is none other than Beit El, the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And then he sets up, well, let's go ahead and read. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, took the stone that he had put under his head. He set it up for a pillar, poured oil upon it, and he called the name of that place Beit El, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go, will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, and Jehovah will be my God. This stone which I'd set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you shall give me, I will surely give a tenth unto thee. Now, a couple of points. Ladies and gentlemen, this encounter is a dream. And I will say that everything forward of this point and the fulfillment thereof is based on historical fact. In other words, this is history, but it's also built upon a dream. A dream that Jacob was given. Whenever the people of Israel ultimately come back from the nations, they say, when we returned to Zion, we were like those who dreamed. I pointed this out before. If you've ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, I remember distinctly the first time that I saw it. And when Dorothy wakes up and it had all been a dream, I was like, what? This has been a dream? Might not work for everyone. The comparison for me, though, works. It's this idea that the entire biblical plan, the very plan that God establishes and brings to fulfillment, is carried through the ages on a dream. Dreams are what keep the prophetic vision going. Dreams are how God will choose to communicate to his people. The book of Numbers makes this fairly clear, right? Remember, he talks about, with Moses I speak face to face, but if there is a prophet among you, I will speak to him in dreams. The book of Joel says that in the latter days, God's people, the young men will dream dreams and the old men will have visions. This idea of God's plan being carried forth on a dream should not be underemphasized. He sees a ladder, it's called a sulam in Hebrew, an ascent, and at the top of it is Jehovah and the Malachim, the messengers are going up and down, and they're bringing this message. And in this dream, there's a promise made, a promise that had been made to his father and his father before that. In this dream, these promises conveyed in the dream involve a land and descendants. You'll recall that Jacob has no descendants at this point. The descendants, we are told, will be like the dust of the earth. And then we're given an interesting piece of information. Your descendants, Jacob, will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. He doesn't tell him they're all going to be right there together forever and eternal. They're going to be spread out. The patriarchal promises are conveyed to Jacob in this dream, that all the families of the earth will bless themselves. Jehovah promises to be with these people. And he says, and I will bring them back to this land. Interestingly enough, the promise that God will bring the people back to the land is one of the most repeated themes in all of Scripture, and yet people often pay limited attention to this idea. But it's the dominant theme in Scripture. It's what did God promise? We often hold God to promises that he didn't make. What is it that God says he's going to do? Now there's another story that is set in Bethel, and it involves the returning to the land. So I want to make it very important to tell you, Hosea 12 says that there at Bethel, God spoke with us. Now I'm reading that in 2019 saying, there God speaks with us. I want you to be part of the us as well. In Hosea chapter 12, it says that at Bethel, God spoke with us. In Genesis 28, Jacob is fleeing his brother, and he hears from God in Bethel, Genesis 28. When he returns to the land many years later, having gained himself women and children, once again at Bethel, God speaks with him, and I believe with us. I want you to go with me to Genesis chapter 35. Genesis chapter 35. Beginning in verse 1, and God spake unto Jacob, arise, cum, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God who appeared unto thee when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. And Jacob put unto his household, or said unto his household, and to all that were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourself, and change your garments, and let us arise and go up to Bethel. I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hand, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and a terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Yaakov. So Jacob came to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan. The same is Beit El, he and all the people that were with him. And he built there an altar and called the place El Beit El, because there God was revealed unto him when he fled from the face of his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Beit El under the oak, and the name of it was called Alon Bachut. God appeared unto Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him, and God said unto him, Thy name is Yaakov, your name shall no longer be called Yaakov, but Israel shall be your name. And he called his name Israel. Now remember, this is the second account of the naming, the name change from Jacob to Israel. Verse 11, And God said unto him, I am El Shaddai. Ani El Shaddai, be fruitful and multiply. Nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of your loins. And the land which I gave unto Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and your seed after thee will I give the land. And God went up from him in the place where he spake with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he spake with him, pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink offering thereon and poured oil thereon. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Beit El. Now, how is it that God could speak with us in this particular story? Or to modern Israel, the descendants who are waking up from the dry ground when the Spirit comes upon them, what is it that they should take from this story if truly, as Hosea 12 says, at Beit El God spoke with us? Here are a few things. How about rid yourselves of your alien gods? Before the children of Israel can go back into the land, they are told to rid themselves of their gods. Now you might think, well, why would they have other gods with them? Well, if you read the story, Rachel did. Rachel has the gods of her fathers with her. She stole those gods as they go towards the land of promise. She still got them with her. Her father chases after his gods, tries to find them. She deceives him to hide them. Now, I think Jacob knows at some point that the gods are with them, and the reason I can say that is because here in this text he says, okay, now give up your gods. So before the children of Israel will be able to go into the land promised to the fathers prophetically, I believe that we have a historical precedent here. I think that we have a picture of what has to happen. Today, if you hearken, you should hear the message of Jehovah to you, and that is to put away those foreign gods, to cleanse yourself from idolatry. We're told that Jacob, when his name is changed to Israel, Israel is told, look, a nation and an assembly of nations will be from you. A nation and an assembly of nation will be from you. Over the course of this particular study, we're going to search the Scripture for facts regarding this chosen family that is called Israel. We're going to leave no stone unturned. We're going to look at history. We're going to look at prophecy. We're going to examine terms, phrases, names, various descriptions that are given of these groups so that you can see them on every page and you don't miss important messages from these prophecies. We're going to study the patriarchal narratives in order to fully grasp the promises that are made to the fathers. And we're going to study prophecies and discover clues that will make it obvious to us whenever the text is talking about all Israel and the identity thereof. Now, there are historical narratives that are going to provide us, just like today, with insights into latter day fulfillment. I think that's one of the things that we'll point out. Hosea, for instance, today pointed out that Jacob spoke, that when God spoke to Jacob at Bethel, he was speaking to us. Bethel, in the dream, he's told, remember, your descendants will spread out to the west and the east and the north and the south. In Genesis chapter 32, Jacob was told, Jacob names this place Mahanaim, 2 camps. Now I want you to go with me to Song of Songs. Now in the English, it's going to be chapter 6, verse 13. Chapter 6, verse 13, and in the Hebrew, it's chapter 7 and verse 1. Genesis 32 said Mahanaim. This is why we're here. Return, return, O Shulamite. Return, return, that we may look upon you. What will you see in the Shulamite? As it were, the dance of Mahanaim. The Song of Songs has long been understood to be an allegory, a love story between God and his people. And this particular text is interesting to me. First of all, the person, the male figure is calling for the Shulamite to return. Now the Shulamite, what is Shulamite? Shulamite means perfected one. It's from the root shalom, which means to be whole or complete or perfect, unblemished. Now notice that the call to return is made 4 times. Shuv, shuvi, 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 shuvi. Return, 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 O Shulamite. The call has to go out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. The idea is that when the call is made to this one who is being restored, that it will go out to the 4 directions. Today was an introduction to the most important subject in biblical literature, the subject of the tribes. Who is Israel? Who is the seed of Abraham, my friend? We're going to get into this over the next several weeks. I'm going to ask you not to miss a single class and to join us next week, Saturday morning, 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time, for the next class in our series on the tribes. I'm going to be talking next week about the seed of Abraham. Shabbat Shalom. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll come back with a dialogue.